Okay, so I came to UCD in 1962. At that stage, science was being taught in Earlsfort Terrace and in Merrion Street. So I was an undergraduate there for my first and second years. So that was 62, 63 and 63, 64. Then we made the transition to Belfield. Now, as a physicist, in my first year I had 4 subjects: physics, chemistry, maths and botany. In my second year I dropped the botany, and in my third year I dropped botany and chemistry. So I ended up being a physicist. So the move to Belfield for us was an absolutely fantastic experience, because you have to think of the spirit of the times. For a scientist, we had DNA, we had the splitting of DNA, we had NASA. NASA was founded in 1958. So all of these things were in the background, and they motivated a lot of young people to do science. And I'd have to say that the first 2 years of my scientific practical work in Merrion Street and in Earlsfort Terrace was fairly primitive. The labs were awful. They were Victorian, right? I remember just long, traditional, classical benches and cupboards with glass panels, right? And really boring, ancient experiments. Now, when you're studying physics, you actually want to do some more modern things. But we got none of that until we moved to Belfield. And the move to Belfield was fantastic. Not only in terms of the fact that we had these wonderful new buildings, but they were also equipped with modern devices and so on. And one of the really exciting early developments for us as undergraduates was the fact that there had been a program in Europe whereby the United States was running a program called Atoms for Peace, popularizing nuclear energy. For us as undergraduates, when we moved here in '64, not only did we have new buildings that were fantastically endowed with space and so on, but they had modern equipment, because the US government had a program called Atoms for Peace, whereby they granted in aid some modern electronic measure devices and nuclear energy measuring devices. So here we were as third-year students using this sophisticated, state-of-the-art equipment. Some of it actually had transistors inside. And we were doing measurements on the atom, on the radiations that are produced from atoms, like alpha particles, beta particles, gamma rays, neutrons, and so on. And these were done in dedicated, different little laboratories, because there was so much space there. We could have a laboratory for electricity, a laboratory for nuclear physics, a laboratory for electronics, and so on, all contained within the one building. So that was absolutely fascinating. Now, there was one small downside at the very beginning, and that was that because we were pioneers, although the structure of the buildings was finished and they were all kitted out, the boiler house was not connected. It was a very cold October, November, December. So the dean of the faculty, who was Professor Thomas Nevin, he allowed women to wear slacks or jeans in the lab, and anoraks and duffel coats if they were cold. So we had this wonderful situation where we were fully dressed with old-fashioned, do you remember the duffel coats with the toggles and so on, to stay warm in the labs. And as well as that, we didn't have restaurants. The restaurant had not been built. Ultimately, in the infill building in the science block, a restaurant appeared. But for the first year or 15 months, a part of the physics department doubled as a restaurant. And the third and fourth year students from both chemistry and physics and the staff would get hot soup or sandwiches in this makeshift restaurant. So, but it didn't matter. We were all pioneers, and we just loved the opportunity of being those pioneers and, exploiting everything we could. Now, I should say that there was one other downside, and that was that we were the only people on campus. So socially, it wasn't much fun. But that didn't really matter, because we had the pioneering spirits. We gelled together as a group. In my group, I think there were only 19 of us in the third year physics. So we really all became very good friends. And those friendships sustain. We do meet a number of times a year to renew old friendship and so on. In terms of the actual movement itself, we felt extremely privileged. The movement of equipment from Earlsfort Terrace out to the Belfield, the new Belfield Science buildings, took place in the summer of 1964. So by the time we arrived as undergraduates, the labs were pretty well kitted out. The lecture theatres within the physics department and within the chemistry department were functional. The botany geology block was not occupied. They didn't arrive until a year later. So in terms of the infrastructure that we met when we arrived, that was really good, amazingly good by comparison with what we had had previously at Earlsfort Terrace. There was no restaurant, okay? So we had to make do with converting part of the physics department, a big laboratory, a spectroscopy laboratory, into a makeshift restaurant. And it was very intimate, it was very homely, because not only did the third and fourth year students meet there, but also the staff. The staff would come down and they would sit with us and have bowls of soup or whatever it was. So it was a really nice, intimate, friendly atmosphere. We were indeed aware of the changing landscape in Belfield, because when we moved out, only the chemistry block, the physics block, and the biology block were completed. But the centre block, which was to be the lecture theatres, that was only beginning to be developed. So we were certainly aware of building going on all the time as that central infill building was completed. Having escaped from Earlsfort Terrace, although there was nothing else on the Belfield site other than this gradually evolving science block, it was just fantastic by comparison with what had gone before. The new buildings, they were extremely spacious, and there had been a lot of money spent on equipping the laboratories. So this was completely different than what I had told you about earlier about Earlsfort Terrace. We had these wonderful spacious laboratories. They were beautifully equipped, and suddenly we really felt that we were real physics students, because we had real equipment that wasn't Dickensian, right? It was modern stuff that had been bought when we moved there. So that was a fantastic experience for us, to have modern laboratories. I personally feel that the major motivation for getting the science student to the Belfield campus first was the fact that the professor of physics, Professor Thomas Nevin at that time, was an extremely influential person. And he realized that that Earlsfort Terrace was so cramped that it was really impossible to have any form of modern laboratories. And of course, as you would appreciate, engineering, chemistry, and physics are very laboratory intensive. So it was his vision to move science out to the Belfield campus first, because we were extremely cramped in Earlsfort Terrace. The engineers at that stage were in Merrion Street. They also had a difficult situation, but they didn't come out until the early 70s. Yes, well, in terms of the evolution of UCD during my undergraduate years, it was quite remarkable because my first 2 years were in Earlsfort Terrace and in Merrion Street. Earlsfort Terrace, we had our physics lectures and practicals, we had mathematics there, and in Merrion Street we had chemistry, and I did botany in first year as well. So that was really not a very exciting environment to try and do science, modern science. And remember, this was now, the space age was coming in, NASA had been formed, so we were all very conscious of what was happening in the world. And to suddenly, in the summer of 1964, to be told that our third year and our fourth year undergraduate work would be done in the new campus at Belfield, that was just fantastic. I mean, it was another world altogether. All the labs were beautifully kitted out. The experiments were all modern. The staff at that time in physics was extremely young, and they would often socialize with us. And we were only a small number of people. I think there were only 19 of us in the third year class, and in the fourth year class that was ahead of us, I think there were about 15. So it was a very small, tight, intimate group. And we all became very good friends. We socialized together. Now, we had issues. As I said earlier, we didn't have the boiler operational until almost Christmas. But it didn't really matter. We got on with it. We had fun. We socialized. We made friendships. And I think the beauty of the new buildings more than compensated for any hardship that we had. Oh yes, I mean that was a big distraction often as to how the campus evolved with time, because there was a lot of noise, okay? There was a lot of building going on, and I remember right at the end of the 1960s, they built the lake, the lake in Belfield. That, we were told, was built ostensibly to be a store of water in case there was a fire, because the pressure that was available around the campus wasn't great. So this was a reservoir of water in case anything went on fire. That's what we were told. I don't know whether that's apocryphal or not, but it's a good story. All that evolved gradually from '66 onwards. I suppose the center block in science got built around 65 to 67. And the ground floor of that then became a proper restaurant for all of those who were on campus at that stage. Then gradually, building got underway, as I said, to build other faculty buildings. I guess the administration building was one of the earliest ones over beyond the lake. And then engineering came in about 1970 or 71. So it was a slow process of infill. And I suppose in the early years, certainly from 64 to about 70, it was fairly primitive. Like, there were no buses coming onto campus. There was no major entrance down at Stillorgan opposite what was the Montrose Hotel. There was just a narrow track there. Or you could come in at the Clonskee side, but there wasn't a proper roadway. You just walked down a track, and then you walked on top of the feed from the boiler house down into the central science reservations. That was all concreted over. There was no road, so you just walk along the top of that. I mean, it was bizarre. You can't imagine it when you see the campus now. No, not at that point. I think the only students who were on campus for the first 3 or 4 years were science students. And then gradually engineering was built, and I think that became occupied around 70 or 71. And the administration centre was built, and then slowly it infilled. So it was kind of a lonely existence at the beginning. No, I mean, like many people at that time, it was either Trinity or UCD. And I was very interested in science from my early teens, and I knew that there was a new science block coming. to UCD, and that the first buildings would be the science block. So that was a very determining factor in me wanting to come to UCD. Unfortunately, the first 2 years were in Earlsfort Terrace, and the laboratories there were, as I said earlier, they weren't particularly well equipped with stuff. But there was a great social scene there. And then we moved out to Belfield in '64, and we just had to form our own social scene with all the students who were on campus at that time. And there were probably less than 100. And there was no restaurant or so on. And the library hadn't been built. So we really felt that we were pioneers, that there was a pioneering spirit, and that this was a unique opportunity. And I think this helped everybody to gel together, because some of us are still friends. We still meet regularly, and we reminisce about the old days.